The beginning of the pandemic, for many, was a time of loss, uncertainty, sudden change, and confusion. But for me, it left me with a sense of familiarity. Instead, I saw that as a blessing in disguise. You see, this wasn't the first time that I'd stayed at home for an extended period of time, longer than I originally anticipated. As a Florida native, born and raised in Miami, I had experienced many windstorms, such as hurricanes. I look fondly back on the times that my parents would prepare me for the storms, that they would, as survivors of Hurricane Andrew, they would make sure we had water and non-perishables, stock up on batteries, and have gasoline in the car. I remember watching my brother heat up cans of food in the backyard, and my sister winding up her hand-powered radio. Putting up hurricane shutters was like Christmas tree ornaments in the wintertime. We were used to this. But one storm was different than the rest. Hurricane Irma came with her rhythmic winds and rains and left my family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues with fallen trees, flooded roads, and down power lines, leaving us without power for up to a month. I was surrounded with those feelings of loss, uncertainty, sudden change, and confusion. And I desperately wanted to go back to the way things used to be. The previous storms, which all used to be like 2 or 3 days off from school, but when I went back to my normal, now it had changed. I realized when I was able to go back to school, I was excited, but I had accumulated stress in a different way. I then learned to call those moments panic attacks, and I would have 18 more that year before I realized something had to change. I had to change. So I decided to go and build up a way to protect myself and cope with those emotions in that time and have resilience. President Frank, in the spring 2021 commencement, to an audience that went through Hurricane Irma, and most of them graduated in the midst of a pandemic, he said the ability to bounce back and build on lessons learned is not innate. Like all useful skills, resilience is something you develop only through practice. And I realized each storm that I went to, whether a physical one with wind and rain or an emotional one that I had to deal with on my own, I realized that those times were all practice to build resilience in my own life. So I decided, with this knowledge, I built 3 different metaphors, each one building off of the previous one that helped me get through this time. I grew up with music and technology, and I decided to go based off of that. The first metaphor is life is like a television. While this screen doesn't really look like the TVs you all are used to, this is the one that I grew up with. It doesn't have a DVR attached to it, so whenever I came home from school, I would go and watch the different shows that would come on, whether a cartoon or a soap opera. So many children in soap operas. But it's quite interesting because I realized no matter what the show was about, the characters always, through the challenges they went through, by the end of the episode, they were able to learn a little bit more themselves instead of letting the world define them. And they were able to take control of what they had power to instead of complaining about what they didn't. I realized that as a protagonist in my own life, as we are all protagonists in our own lives, that each of us could have that self-authorship and that agency. And in a way, like pressing the play button on television, we get to order where our footsteps go. But I realized there is something missing with this. As I mentioned before, there is a DVR that's missing. So whenever I had to get up for any reason, just a few seconds or even a couple of minutes, I would dread missing the moments where the main character realized that pivotal moment that changed their life. And so one thing that I did different with this with Hurricane Irma than other hurricanes, is I decided to sit and listen. This is the sound of Hurricane Irma as it passed over my house. It sounds a little bit like an AC system, so Guess you gotta go with it. But I realized that with the metaphor, I left out the pause button. During that storm, I was able to take that pause when, in the moment, everything around me was being destroyed. I was able to have that calmness in the moment. So I took the metaphor a little bit old school, and I went with a boombox. I never put a boombox on my shoulder before this picture, so it was a really cool moment. But I remember growing up that my parents would show me, we'll play different audiobooks on the boombox as I would fall asleep. And I would always try desperately to make sure I paused it right before I went to bed so I could pick up where I left. And then also the cool part is sometimes it did go ahead, and I made sure to hit rewind. I realized through my life, those pauses are the different moments where, while we can't stop time, are the moments we acknowledge where we are. And the rewinds, while we can't go and change the past, are us acknowledging what our past was. I enjoyed all of those moments that I got to look and see that each of the storms, each of the hurricanes, were each a rewind of the current circumstances that we all live through now. And with some time, I noticed I had to add a little bit more to this metaphor. While I had the pauses and the plays and the rewind, something more was missing. Life is like a media player, which I have represented on the screen as a laptop, but it could be any portable device that you have, including your phones. With this, there's a section of a recommended, or what's up next, a section that we know that this isn't the last story that we're going through, but just one of many more. I remember that through the pandemic, at the start of it, I was separated from many of my family and friends as they went back to their different places, including my international friends as they went to different countries. And the interesting part is that while that time created that stress of confusion and uncertainty, sudden change and loss, I was able to learn and do new things that existed a bit before. As I adjusted my metaphor, I realized the things around me were adjusting as well. Work from home and online classes existed beforehand, but now a reality all of us have become familiar with. I have friends who did sourdough bread starters, and I even started a Twitch channel, so if you catch me playing Tetris, I noticed that though there are the negatives, there are the lessons that we learned. Having all three of these devices, I know that they won't be the last metaphors. I know for me personally that I no longer have the stress of panic attacks in the same way, and because I learned that through life, I have to change my view. There's this one really cool movie that I watched back when I was a little kid that I realized all of these three metaphors apply to. Meet the Robinsons. It was the first time I went to the movie theaters without both of my parents, so I felt like I was an adult. In the movie, this 12-year-old boy who wants to be adopted goes to over 100 different interviews with potential parents. And after multiple failures, he decides to go, and as an inventor, he makes a device to go and see into his past. And while the device doesn't work at the beginning of the movie, he goes through those challenges, and at the end, when he is given the opportunity to see his mother, after he's given the chance to go and see the future and what it holds in store for him and the people he would meet, he decided not to see who his mother was, and instead held on to those moments to realize that his future had so much in store. A Walt Disney quote that inspired the movie, he then said, "We keep moving forward." I realized that in each of our own lives, we have to keep moving forward, not only in the sense of the physical storms, but the emotional ones as well. Learning through all of these things, I realized that I had to be diligent in my resilience and vigilant in my observations. I encourage you all to do the same. Thank you.